The chamber had no windows. That was intentional. The architects of the Interstellar Deliberative Council, a body whose formal founding predated humanity's discovery of fire, had decided over 3,000 years ago that a governing assembly should not be distracted by the stars it was meant to steward. The chamber was carved from the interior of a dark asteroid, pressurized and climate-regulated to serve the biological needs of 17 distinct species. The air smelled faintly of ammonia and pine resin and something metallic that no translator had ever successfully named. Ambassador Sarathul of the collective Threnic stood at the central lectern. She was tall by Threnic standards, nearly 2 meters, with 4 articulated forearms folded in the posture her species used to signal that what followed was not casual opinion but considered, studied conclusion. The chamber, for the first time in 11 standard cycles, was full. Every seat occupied. Every delegation present. That alone told the observing analysts something important. The Galactic Council did not summon full attendance for procedural debates or budget revisions. Full attendance meant one thing: a decision that would alter the shape of history. The question before this body, Sarathul began, her translated voice emerging smooth and careful through each delegate's personal receiver, is not whether the Dominion advance constitutes an existential threat. That determination was made 14 cycles ago. The question is whether we formally extend the Coalition's defense framework to include the Sol system, and by extension formally request the active military participation of the human species in this war. The chamber was quiet. Not the quiet of disinterest. The quiet of something enormous being turned over carefully in many minds at once. The Dominion advance, as the Council's diplomatic corps had named it, carefully avoiding the word invasion in official documentation, had begun as a border dispute in the outer Kareth Reach, some 400 light-years from Earth. A species called the Vardesi, whose civilization was organized along rigid hierarchical conquest principles, had tested the outer boundary of Coalition space with probe fleets, then with armed skirmishers, then with coordinated deep strike operations that had destroyed 3 inhabited colony stations and 1 generation ship carrying 40,000 Ledhani refugees. That was 12 cycles ago. Since then, the Vardesi Dominion had advanced an average of 2.3 light-years per cycle into Coalition territory, absorbing or destroying 11 inhabited systems. Their fleet doctrine was not sophisticated by Coalition standards. They relied on mass, on sustained pressure, on the willingness to absorb catastrophic losses in exchange for incremental territorial gain. It was a strategy that was brutal, slow, and, against most Coalition member species, working. The Coalition's military arm, the compact fleet, had fought them to several costly stalemates. But stalemates were not victories, and 14 cycles of attrition had degraded the compact fleet's reserve capacity to levels that the Strategic Assessment Bureau described in its most recent report as structurally unsustainable beyond 8 additional cycles. 8 cycles. Roughly 40 human years. Which brought Sarathul to her argument. The human species, she continued, advancing the holographic display to show Sol's position relative to the current front lines, has been under passive observation by this council since their development of long-range radio communication, approximately 112 of their years ago. They have been under active observation, with shielded monitoring assets, for the past 63 years. In that period, we have compiled what I believe to be the most comprehensive behavioral and strategic assessment of any pre-contact species in this council's history. She paused to let that register. Pre-contact species assessments were normally a formality, a catalog of developmental stage, technological level, cultural stability index. The kind of document that gathered organizational dust for centuries before being revisited upon formal first contact. Sarathul's assessment of humanity ran to 947 annotated volumes. I want to be precise about what I am proposing, she said. I am not proposing we recruit humanity because they are exceptional. I am proposing we contact humanity because the mathematical probability of Coalition survival without expanding our active military capacity within the next 4 cycles is 17%. And because among all pre-contact species within plausible range of the current front, the humans are the only ones whose technological level, population scale, and, I will use the clinical term, behavioral profile make them viable candidates for combat integration on a timeline that is relevant to our immediate needs. Delegate Vorith of the Muir Ascendancy raised a secondary limb. Viable candidates. You use that phrase carefully, Ambassador. Deliberately. Then let me ask the obvious question that the assessment no doubt addresses. Vorith's translator rendered his next words in a register that the listening humans, had any been present, would have recognized as reluctant respect. Are they stable enough to fight alongside us without becoming a secondary problem? Sarathul looked at the room. 17 species. Hundreds of years of collective diplomatic experience. Every one of them waiting for exactly this answer. That, she said, is what the next 8 hours of testimony will determine. The chamber's ambient sound system, designed to prevent the acoustically unpleasant silence that several species found physiologically distressing, produced a faint, neutral hum. No one moved toward the exit. Outside the asteroid 400 light-years away, a Vardesi fleet of approximately 300 vessels was reorienting toward the next system on its advanced schedule. The system contained 2 inhabited planets and a coalition listening post that had been transmitting increasingly fragmented situation reports for the past 11 days. The Council had approximately 6 weeks before that system fell. The vote had not yet been called. But in the chamber carved from rock and silence and the weight of 3,000 years of careful governance, something had already shifted. Sarathul could feel it in the way the delegations were looking not at her, but at the holographic star map, and specifically at the small, unremarkable yellow star at its center. Sol. Third planet. 8 billion people who did not yet know they were being considered for a war. The testimony was about to begin. The testimony was given by a Threnic analyst named Yoskavol, who had spent 31 years as the lead coordinator of the Sol observation program. He was not a diplomat. He was a behavioral scientist, and he presented his findings the way scientists present findings. With data, with caveats, and with a visible reluctance to simplify things that were genuinely complicated. The Council appreciated the caveats. They had learned, over 3,000 years, to distrust anyone who claimed easy answers about a species. The first thing to understand about the human species, Yoskavol said, bringing up the first of what would be many displays, is that our early models were significantly wrong. When we began active observation 63 years ago, the prevailing analytical framework, based on their developmental arc, their resource competition patterns, and their history of interspecies conflict, predicted a 60 to 70% probability of civilizational self-termination via nuclear exchange within 200 years. He paused. That probability has been revised to 11%. The revision is not because humanity has become peaceful. It is because humanity has become, in ways our models did not anticipate, systematically better at managing the conditions that produce catastrophic conflict. Delegate Vorath of the Muir Ascendancy leaned forward. Better in what sense? Institutionally. Technologically, and in ways that are harder to quantify, culturally. Yoskavol advanced the display to a graphic showing the distribution of armed conflicts on Earth over the past century, with intensity, duration, and casualty rate mapped across a timeline. 100 years ago, humanity was engaged in what their own historians classify as the most destructive conflict in their recorded history. Approximately 70 to 85 million dead in 6 years, with significant secondary deaths from displacement, disease, and famine. He let that number sit in the chamber for a moment. For context, the Threnic had never, in their 3,000 years of recorded civilization, experienced a single conflict that killed more than 4 million. In the decades that followed that conflict, humanity did something that our analysts initially classified as an anomaly, and later revised to a characteristic pattern. They built institutions. Imperfect institutions. The data is clear that their international governance frameworks are slow, contentious, and frequently ineffective. But they built them. And they have, over 80 years, incrementally expanded the scope and enforcement capacity of those institutions. The rate of large-scale interstate warfare has declined by approximately 70% since the mid-20th century of their calendar. Per capita violent death is at its lowest recorded level. You are describing a species in the process of learning to govern itself, said Ambassador Preth of the Lethani Accord. Her voice carried something that the translation algorithm rendered as careful neutrality, which those who knew her recognized as interest. Yes. Which is relevant to the Council's question because the same institutional learning curve is visible in their military development. Yoskavol brought up a new display, a comparative analysis of human military doctrine over the past 70 years. Humanity's armed forces have undergone a significant doctrinal shift. Early Cold War doctrine, the period of peak nuclear standoff tension, was characterized by what you might call strategic maximalism, the planning assumption that any major conflict would escalate to civilizational scale exchange. That assumption has been progressively replaced by what their theorists call limited war doctrine, the idea that military force can and should be applied in calibrated, bounded ways to achieve defined political objectives, without necessarily destroying the opponent's capacity to exist as a coherent entity. That is a doctrine that requires significant restraint, observed Delegate Seamuth of the Karathi Federation, whose species had fought a war of total annihilation against a neighboring civilization approximately 800 years prior and still carried the institutional memory of how that had ended. It does. And the data shows they do not always exercise it successfully. There are numerous historical examples of mission expansion, disproportionate response, and strategic miscalculation. I want to be clear about that. I am not presenting humanity as a species that has solved the problem of war. I am presenting them as a species that is actively working on it, with measurable progress. The chamber was quiet again, but differently than before. This was the quiet of recalibration. Tell us about their military capacity, said Sarathul. Not doctrine. Numbers. Yoskoval nodded. Currently, Earth maintains approximately 2 million active-duty military personnel across all national armed forces, with an additional 3 to 4 million in reserve or paramilitary configurations. Their naval capacity, relevant to space warfare, consists primarily of surface vessels and submarines, but their space launch infrastructure has expanded significantly in the past 20 years. They have maintained a continuous human presence in orbital space for over 2 decades. They have landed robotic systems on every major body in their solar system. Their propulsion technology is approximately 40 years behind coalition standard, but the rate of development has accelerated sharply. 40 years behind, repeated Delegate Vorath. And you believe they could be brought to combat-relevant capacity within 4 cycles, roughly 20 of their years? With direct technology transfer and accelerated training integration, the Strategic Assessment Bureau's estimate is 3 to 5 cycles for basic fleet combat capability. The caveat, and this is important, is that the estimate assumes voluntary cooperation. The humans must agree to this. They cannot be drafted into someone else's war without their informed consent and without understanding what they are committing to. And if they refuse? Yoskoval looked at his data. The probability models suggest they will not refuse. Not because they are reckless and not because they are naive. But because, and this is perhaps the finding that most surprised our analytical team, when humanity perceives a genuine existential threat to others, the historical pattern shows a strong tendency toward engagement rather than avoidance. He brought up a final display. Case studies. Dozens of them drawn from human history. Interventions undertaken at significant cost and risk when uninvolved parties were threatened. Aid missions into active conflict zones. The deployment of military force in circumstances where strategic interest alone could not justify the cost. They have a word for it, Yoskoval said. Several words across many languages. The underlying concept is approximately the obligation to act when one is capable of preventing serious harm to others. The chamber sat with that. That is a dangerous moral framework to hold, said Delegate Seamuth slowly, in a galaxy at war. Yes, said Yoskoval. It is. Whether it is dangerous to us or dangerous to the Verdesi Dominion, is largely a question of how this council decides to proceed. He closed his display. I have answered the empirical questions as fully as I can. The normative question, whether to contact them, is yours. The opposition was not irrational. That was the part history would later struggle to render fairly. When the Council's official record of the contact debate was eventually declassified and made available to human scholars, some 40 years after first contact, the temptation among human readers was to treat the opposing delegates as villains. As species who had looked at humanity and seen something threatening, something lesser, something to be kept at arm's length from galactic civilization out of fear or prejudice. The truth was more uncomfortable. The opposition had coherent arguments. Some of them were right. Delegate Mareth of the Shan continuity was the first to formally register dissent. The Shan were an old species, one of the founding members of the Council, with a continuous recorded history spanning 11,000 years. They had seen civilizations rise and collapse. They had watched species reach for the stars and find things in the dark that broke them. They had, in 2 separate historical instances, been present at the moment another species made first contact with a hostile force and had spent the next century dealing with the aftermath. My concern is not that humanity is dangerous to us, Mareth said, his translation carrying the deliberate cadence of someone who had prepared this statement carefully. My concern is that we are potentially dangerous to them. He let that register. What we are proposing, beneath the diplomatic language about defense frameworks and military integration, is first contact under crisis conditions. We would be introducing humanity not to a galaxy of wonders and opportunities and complex civilizations that have managed to coexist for thousands of years. We would be introducing them to a war. Their first experience of the interstellar community would be, here is a species that wants to destroy you, here is a fleet you are expected to contribute to, here is a conflict that has already cost billions of lives across 11 systems. The Lethani, he continued, naming the species that had lost 40,000 people to the Verdesi attack on the Generation ship, came to this council as a spacefaring civilization seeking trade relationships. They had 50 years of positive contact before they encountered violence. They had institutions, frameworks, cultural resources for processing what happened to them. Humanity would have none of that. They would be thrown into the deep end of a galaxy they have never seen, at war with a species they have never heard of, asked to fight alongside beings whose biology, values, and decision-making processes they have had no time to understand. He paused. The psychological and civilizational stress of that introduction could be severe. I am not opposed to contact in principle. I am opposed to contact in these circumstances at this speed, with this framing. It was a serious argument. Several delegates nodded. Delegate Vosh of the Seth Principality took a different line. The Seth were traders, primarily. Their civilization had been built on the management of information and exchange, and Vosh's objections were characteristically practical. The assessment estimates 3 to 5 cycles for basic fleet combat capability. Let me put that another way, we are asking humanity to go from first contact to active combat participation in roughly 15 to 25 of their years. To do that, we would need to transfer significant military technology to them, propulsion systems, targeting architecture, shielding. That technology does not come with a retrieval option. We are proposing to permanently alter the technological trajectory of an 8 billion person species as a strategic convenience. And we are proposing to do it in a compressed time frame that does not allow for the kind of trust building and verification that normally precedes technology transfer at this level. He spread his hands, a gesture his species used when presenting a calculation that did not favor the desired outcome. If this war ends, whether we win or lose, we will have armed humanity. That is a permanent consequence. And it will have been done not because we decided humanity was ready for that responsibility, but because we were desperate. That drew a longer silence than anything else said so far. It was Delegate Suri of the Pelathai Communion who gave the opposition its hardest edge. The Pelathai had lost 2 colony worlds to the Verdesi advance. They were not disinterested parties. But their loss had produced not urgency but something colder. The behavioral analysis presented by the Soul Observation Program is thorough. I do not dispute its conclusions within its scope. Suri's translator rendered her next words in a register that carried weight. My question is about what the analysis does not measure. She brought up her own display. Humanity has been at continuous warfare with other humans for the entirety of their recorded history. They have developed weapons of mass destruction and used them on civilians. They have conducted genocides. They have built systems of large-scale exploitation and defended them for centuries before dismantling them. The analyst correctly notes that the trend lines are improving. The rate of large-scale conflict is declining. Institutional capacity is growing. But trend lines are not guarantees. And what we are proposing is not to observe humanity for another 50 years and check back in. We are proposing to hand them interstellar travel, advanced weapons systems, and a war. We do not know what humanity becomes under those conditions. We have models. We have behavioral assessments. We do not have certainty. She looked at Sarathol directly. The assessment's author has told us that humanity, when it perceives a genuine threat to others, tends toward engagement. I do not doubt that finding. What I am asking this council to consider is, after the war, when they are a spacefaring species with a battle-tested fleet and the knowledge that they helped save the coalition, who will manage that engagement instinct? Who manages a humanity that has spent 20 years learning to fight, and then finds that the galaxy contains many things worth fighting about? The chamber's ambient hum seemed louder for a moment. It was Sarathol who answered, and she answered with the only honest response available. We do not know. What we do know is that if we do not contact them and the Verdesi advance continues on its current trajectory, the question of managing a post-war humanity becomes irrelevant, because there will not be a post-war anything to manage. That, said Suri, is precisely the kind of reasoning I am most afraid of. The logic of emergency has a way of becoming the logic of everything. She sat down. No one had a clean response to that. Not even Sarathol. The debate continued for 3 more hours. When it finally moved to procedural motions, 11 delegations had formally registered opposition. 6 had registered qualified support contingent on specific safeguards. 17 had signaled general support for the contact proposal. The vote was not yet called. There was one more testimony scheduled. The final witness was not an analyst or a diplomat. The final witness was the only alien who had ever, quietly and without authorization, made partial contact with a human being. His name, in Threnic, translated approximately as, the one who watches from the still water. The Council's records identified him only as Observer Designate 7 Keth. He had spent 14 years as a field asset of the Sol Observation Program, stationed in a concealed orbital platform at L4, one of Earth's gravitational balance points, monitoring communications, analyzing media, and compiling the behavioral datasets that fed into Yoskovol's 947 volumes. He had done all of that correctly and professionally. He had also done one thing that was not sanctioned, not reported until after his rotation ended, and that had resulted in a formal disciplinary review and a 3-cycle suspension of his observational clearances. He had made indirect contact with a human. "I want to be precise about what happened," 7 Keth said to the chamber, in the careful tone of someone who had spent a long time thinking about how to describe something that did not fit neatly into professional categories. "I did not reveal myself. I did not transmit any information that would constitute a breach of the non-interference protocol under its primary provisions. What I did was respond." He explained the circumstances. In the 9th year of his observation rotation, he had been monitoring a radio telescope facility in the southern hemisphere of Earth's primary landmass. The facility was operated by a team of 4 researchers working on the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence program, a long-running human scientific effort that had, with considerable dedication and almost no institutional support, been listening for signs of non-human intelligence for decades. One of the researchers, a woman the observation records identified only by her professional designation, Dear 7 SETI 44, had been conducting a targeted sweep of a specific frequency band. She had been doing so for 11 years. She had found nothing, submitted her findings to journals that politely declined to publish them, and continued. "On the evening of the 43rd day of my 9th rotation year," 7 Keth said, "she was alone in the facility. Her colleagues had gone to a regional conference. She was running an automated sweep and working on a separate paper. At approximately 2 hours past local midnight, she received an anomalous signal on her monitoring array." He paused. "The signal was not from me. It was low-level electromagnetic interference from a compact fleet courier vessel that had passed within 4 light minutes of the Sol system on a transit route, the kind of signal that should have been below the threshold of human detection given the distance and the interference background. It was not below her threshold. She had modified her detection algorithms. The modification was documented in an unpublished paper she had written 2 years prior that had been rejected by 3 separate journals. The modification was correct. She detected the signal. The chamber was very still. She spent 6 hours trying to verify it. She was meticulous. I watched her run the same confirmation sequence 4 times, then a 5th time with a different instrument configuration to rule out equipment artifact. She was operating alone, without anyone to cross-check her conclusions, and she was aware that an extraordinary claim made by a single researcher without corroboration would not be taken seriously. She wrote her initial findings in a private log, not an official report. He consulted his notes. The entry reads, in translation, "I am either looking at the most important signal in human history, or I need to recalibrate the northeast array again. I have recalibrated the northeast array 4 times. I don't think it's the array." Several delegates made sounds that their translators rendered as laughter. I had been authorized to observe. I was not authorized to interact. But she was going to file a report in the morning, and that report, even if dismissed, even if ignored, which it likely would have been, would have created a record. A record that, eventually, in the wrong hands or the right ones, might have drawn attention to the courier route, which ran within ranging distance of one of our primary monitoring platforms. He was quiet for a moment. I modulated the interference pattern. Very slightly. Just enough to make the signal fall below her verification threshold when she ran her final confirmation sequence. She recalibrated the northeast array 1 more time. The signal did not recur. She wrote in her log, "Probable equipment artifact after all. Recalibrating. Sleep deprivation affecting judgment. Going home." She went home. She did not file the report. Another pause. I have thought about that decision every day since. Whether it was the right one. Whether I protected our operation or whether I took something from her. The finding would have been dismissed by the scientific establishment. The probability models on that were over 90%. But she had been right. She had spent 11 years looking for something real, and she had found evidence of it, and I erased it. He looked at the chamber. I am not here to relitigate that decision. My supervisors have already done that extensively. I am here because Ambassador Sarathol believed the council should hear what I observed in 14 years that did not make it into the official analysis. The things that are harder to quantify. He spent the next hour describing them. The researcher who spent 11 years looking for something she was not certain existed and kept looking anyway. The doctors who deployed into active conflict zones not as military assets but as independent volunteers, carrying only supplies and the negotiated protection of a Red Cross. The engineers who had turned back from the edge of a solution because the cost in human lives was unacceptable, even when accepting that cost would have been the faster path. The leaders who had chosen managed defeat over unmanageable victory. None of these are universal patterns, he said carefully. The data contains equal evidence of the opposite. Scientists who buried uncomfortable findings, doctors who stood aside, engineers who took the expedient path, leaders who chose victory over anything else. He paused. What I observed is a species that contains the full range of possibilities, and that is actively, imperfectly, inconsistently but actively, trying to decide which possibilities to cultivate. He looked at the opposing delegates. Delegate Suri asked who manages humanity after the war. I do not have an answer to that. What I can tell you is that from what I observed, humanity spends considerable effort trying to manage itself. Whether that effort is sufficient, whether it scales to the pressures of interstellar civilization, I cannot say. No one can say. Not even them. He stepped back from the lectern. I have one final note. The researcher. 7 SETI 44. 3 years after the incident, she left the SETI program. The official reason given was a change of research focus. Her private correspondence, which we monitored, suggests a different reason. He consulted his notes one final time. She wrote to a colleague, I can't stop thinking about that night in the observatory. I know it was probably equipment failure. But some part of me keeps wondering, what if we're not as alone as the absence of evidence suggests? And if that's true, why haven't they said anything? He set down his notes. She deserves an answer to that question. Whatever this council decides tonight, she deserves to know that her 11 years of looking were not wasted. The chamber was quiet for a long time after he finished. The vote was called 40 minutes later. The transmission was received on a Tuesday. This detail, that the most significant event in human history arrived on an unremarkable weekday, was later noted by historians as somehow characteristic of how the universe tends to operate. Not with ceremony, not timed to any human calendar or cultural moment, but simply when the physics and the logistics aligned and someone decided the delay had gone on long enough. The signal was directed at the primary radio telescope array in New Mexico, which had been upgraded 8 years prior with funding from a coalition of universities and a private aerospace consortium. It was also directed simultaneously at identical arrays in Australia, China, and Norway, a redundancy that the Council's communications team had included deliberately. They did not want the news filtered through a single government. They wanted it received by 4 simultaneously so that no one nation could control the initial narrative. The message was in mathematics first. Prime sequences, then basic arithmetic, then more complex structures building toward a shared language from first principles. This part of the transmission took 11 hours. Human linguists and cryptographers and SETI researchers, most of whom had been woken in the middle of the night and were working in various states of caffeinated urgency, spent those 11 hours in parallel, working the problem from their end, verifying what they were seeing against what should be theoretically possible. By hour 7, 3 separate teams had reached the same preliminary conclusion independently and were, with admirable scientific discipline, refusing to share it until they had run additional verification. By hour 9, the verification was complete. By hour 11, the signal moved from mathematics to language, a constructed bridge language assembled from the patterns found in decades of monitored human communications, careful and slow and designed to be understood by someone who had never heard it before, and began to convey meaning. The first sentence, as it was later officially translated, was, "We have been your neighbors for a long time. We should have introduced ourselves sooner. We are sorry that we did not." The apology was not in the original Threnic draft. Ambassador Sarathol had added it herself at the last stage of review, overruling 2 junior diplomatic staff members who had argued it was unnecessary. She had added it because Sevenketh's testimony had stayed with her. Because a researcher had spent 11 years looking for something real and had been denied the knowledge that she had found it, and whatever else happened, that deserved acknowledgement. The apology was what broke through the professional detachment of the monitoring teams. One radio astronomer at the New Mexico array, a man who had been awake for 31 hours and was on his third pot of coffee, reportedly put his head down on his console and cried for approximately 4 minutes before returning to his analysis. The governments were notified within the hour. The decision about public announcement was, in the end, taken out of their hands. One of the 4 receiving arrays was operated by a university consortium, and one of the graduate students had contacted a journalist before the institutional protocols caught up. The story was public within 6 hours of the first mathematical sequences. What followed was not, contrary to a significant body of science fiction that humanity had produced on the subject, panic. There was fear, significant, widespread, and entirely rational fear. There was also wonder and argument, and the kind of frantic collective information processing that democracies do when faced with something genuinely unprecedented. Governments convened emergency sessions. Scientists were called before legislative bodies. Religions issued statements that ranged from careful engagement to defensive alarm. Financial markets experienced a day of extraordinary volatility before stabilizing, somewhat, when it became clear that the transmission contained no immediate threat. The second major transmission arrived 72 hours later. This one was longer, and it contained 3 components that had been agreed upon by the full Council after considerable debate. The first component was a description of the Galactic Council, its membership, its history, its structure. Not comprehensive but enough to establish the context, that there was a community of civilizations in this part of the galaxy, that it had been operating for thousands of years, and that humanity had not been excluded from it so much as not yet formally included. The second component was a description of the Vardesi Dominion and the current state of the war. This component had been the subject of the most debate within the Council. Several delegations had argued for delaying this disclosure, allowing a period of peaceful introduction before introducing the conflict. Sarathul had argued against delay on both practical and ethical grounds. On practical grounds, the delay would not be long enough to matter, and humans would eventually learn that the first contact had come with withheld information. On ethical grounds, it was not appropriate to ask humanity to make a decision about their participation in this situation without fully informing them of what that situation was. Sarathul had won that argument. The third component was an explicit statement that humanity was not being asked to do anything. That no obligation was implied by this contact. That the Council recognized the complexity of what it was disclosing and would wait for as long as a response required. That there was a 2-way communication channel embedded in the transmission architecture and humanity was invited to use it when ready. The phrase, "when ready," was also Sarathul's addition. The first human response came 14 days later, from a joint delegation of 6 national governments and 3 international scientific bodies, transmitted in the bridge language and also in 17 of Earth's most widely spoken languages simultaneously. It read in the official translation, "We have received your transmissions. We have spent 2 weeks trying to understand them. We have not succeeded in fully understanding them, but we believe we have understood enough to ask the first questions that need asking." Then below that, "How long has the war been going on? How many people, how many beings, have died? What do you need?" When Sarathul read the response in the council chamber, she did not speak for a moment. Yoskaval, sitting beside her, leaned over and said quietly, "Their third question was, what do you need?" Before they asked about their own security or about what this contact means for them, or about the technology transfer, or about any of the things the models predicted they would prioritize. Sarathul nodded. "I know." She composed the council's response herself. The Strategic Integration Agreement was signed 14 months after first contact. It was not a simple document. The agreement ran to 340 pages in the bridge language, with 11 annexes covering technology transfer protocols, command authority structures, legal frameworks for the treatment of human personnel under coalition military law, mutual defense obligations, post-conflict technology review provisions, and a disputed annex, Annex 7, that addressed the question of human access to compact fleet intelligence on the Vardesi Dominion. Annex 7 had taken 4 months of negotiation by itself. The delay was rational. The humans had asked early in the integration discussions for full access to coalition intelligence on the Vardesi, their fleet dispositions, their doctrine, their historical behavior, their known vulnerabilities. The request made complete military sense. You do not ask a species to fight alongside you and withhold from them the information relevant to their survival. The concern was not about the request. The concern was about what humanity would do with the information beyond the immediate operational context. Full intelligence access on the Vardesi would include data on Vardesi systems, inhabited systems, resource distribution, population centers. Detailed strategic-level information about a hostile civilization. Delegate Suri had raised the issue in the integration working group with characteristic directness. Once humanity has detailed intelligence on an inhabited civilization's infrastructure and vulnerabilities, that information does not disappear when the war ends. We are asking them to trust us with their people's lives. We are also, implicitly, asking ourselves to trust them with information that could inform their strategic behavior in the galaxy for centuries. The resolution had been a phased access framework, intelligence released on a need-to-know basis tied to operational necessity, with a review mechanism that allowed human military commanders to request additional access as specific operational needs arose. It was imperfect. The human military liaison team had said so plainly in writing. But they had accepted it, and the acceptance had been noted in the Council's assessment as a data point consistent with the behavioral profile. Humans operating in institutional frameworks tending to work within agreed structures even when those structures were frustrating. The physical integration began in year 2. The technology transfer was managed through 3 dedicated facilities constructed in the asteroid belt of the Sol system, close enough to Earth to be logistically practical, far enough from inhabited areas to contain the risks inherent in rapidly scaling up alien propulsion and weapons technology in the hands of people who had never used it before. Compact fleet engineering teams worked alongside human military engineers in conditions that were, by most accounts, consistently difficult and occasionally dangerous and characterized by a mutual respect that developed faster than any of the cultural integration models had predicted. The language barrier dissolved faster than expected too. The bridge language was adequate for formal communications but insufficient for the technical intimacy of shared engineering work. Within 18 months, a working pidgin had emerged organically on the integration facilities, a hybrid of the bridge language, standard Threnic technical vocabulary, and an improbable amount of idiom borrowed from the dialects spoken by the largest national contingents on the human side. Compact fleet engineers found themselves using human expressions for concepts their own languages didn't conveniently capture. Human engineers found Threnic precision vocabulary infiltrating their technical documentation. The first human-crewed vessels with compact fleet propulsion systems were tested in year 3. They were not impressive by coalition standards. Modified human spacecraft retrofitted with drives that could achieve roughly 40% of compact fleet courier efficiency, with shielding that a Verdesi skirmisher vessel would have treated as an inconvenience. But they flew. And the human pilots flew them hard. The training program for fleet engagement had been designed to run 8 years. The first human tactical cohort requested acceleration at the 18-month mark, citing what their senior training officer described in a memo as the situation not particularly caring about our optimal training timeline. The request was granted, with provisions. The acceleration required additional risk acceptance on the human side. The early training mortality rate for advanced fleet maneuver exercises was above the coalition standard threshold, and the relevant human governments, after internal debate, formally accepted that risk in writing and submitted the acceptance through official channels. The acceptance document also noted, in a quietly stated appendix, that the signatories recognized the asymmetry of what they were asking their people to accept, and committed to ensuring that the same information be made available to every person who entered the training program voluntarily, without sanitization. That appendix had not been requested by the Council. It had been added by the humans. By year 8, the first human combat vessel, designated ECV Endurance in the English language of its primary crew, with translations registered in 4 additional human languages, entered compact fleet service. It was a frigate-class ship, underpowered by coalition standards and overcrewed by coalition standards, carrying a mixed human Threnic tactical team that had trained together for 2 years and had developed what the integration assessment described as operational cohesion that exceeds modeled expectations for mixed species units at equivalent experience levels. The Endurance's commanding officer, a woman whose name appears in Council records as Commander Adiz Okafor, submitted her vessel's operational readiness report in the bridge language but appended a note in her own language that was translated and circulated among the coalition liaison staff. The note read, "We understand what we're going into. We understand the cost estimates. We are ready. Do not protect us from the information. We fight better when we know what we're actually fighting for." By year 12, 18 human combat vessels were in compact fleet service. By year 17, the number was 243. The Verdesi advance had continued during this period, gaining 7 additional systems before the reinforced coalition lines stabilized it. The war was not going well, but it was going less badly than the Strategic Assessment Bureau's projections at the time of the contact debate. in part because the coalition had managed to negotiate reinforcements from two previously neutral systems, and in part because the human integration had produced doctrinal innovations that the Bureau had not modeled. Human fleet commanders, operating under a military tradition that emphasized decentralized execution and individual officer initiative, had introduced tactical flexibility at the unit level that was unusual in coalition fleet doctrine. Not aggressive recklessness, the behavioral data had predicted that risk, and it had been specifically addressed in the training curriculum. But a willingness to adapt in real time, to deviate from planned formation when conditions warranted, to prioritize the outcome over the procedure. In the 19th major engagement of the conflict following human integration, a defense of the Kareth 7 transit corridor, a human tactical wing operating under Commander Okafor improvised a flanking maneuver under fire that was not in any approved formation manual, was arguably in violation of the engagement protocol's risk thresholds, and successfully broke a Vardesi encirclement that had been projected to result in the loss of 4 coalition vessels. The after-action review noted the protocol deviation. It also noted the outcome. Okafor's written response to the protocol review was 3 sentences. I saw a gap. The gap was real. I took it. The review board closed the case without disciplinary action. In year 20, the Strategic Assessment Bureau revised its projections for the first time in 11 cycles. Upward. The war ended in year 26. Not with a final, decisive battle. Real wars rarely end that way. It ended with a series of operational reversals that degraded the Vardesi Dominion's logistics capacity to the point where sustained advance became impossible, followed by 18 months of back-channel negotiation that the Council's diplomatic corps facilitated between the coalition and the Vardesi command hierarchy, followed by a ceasefire agreement that both sides entered with the wary, exhausted pragmatism of opponents who had come to recognize each other as problems to be managed rather than enemies to be destroyed. The final agreement was not a Vardesi surrender. It was a negotiated boundary settlement with demilitarized zones, phased prisoner exchanges, and an ongoing monitoring framework. It was, in the diplomatic assessment, the best available outcome, not a victory in the absolute sense, but a durable cessation that preserved the coherence of both the coalition and, critically, of the Vardesi Dominion as a functioning civilization. That last provision, the one that preserved the Vardesi, had been championed most vocally in the final negotiating sessions by the human delegation. This was the thing the Council had not expected. Or rather, it was the thing they had discussed in the contact debate as a theoretical risk, the unmanageable post-war humanity, and had not expected to manifest as this. Delegate Suri had warned about an expansionist humanity, a humanity emboldened by 20 years of warfare and the knowledge of its own effectiveness. She had not been wrong to raise that concern. The concern had been valid. The behavioral history supported it. What the behavioral history had underweight was something Seven Keth had tried to describe from his 14 years of observation. The active, imperfect, inconsistent effort of a species trying to decide which of its possibilities to cultivate. In the final negotiating session, the lead human diplomatic delegate, a man named Kwame Asante who had been 19 years old when the first contact transmissions arrived and had spent his entire adult professional life working on the integration, had made the argument for Vardesi preservation on straightforwardly strategic grounds. A destroyed or collapsed Vardesi Dominion would create a power vacuum across 40 light-years of now unmanaged space. That vacuum would be filled by something, and the probability that the something would be more stable than the existing Vardesi hierarchy was not favorable. He had also made the argument on other grounds. 12 systems, he had said in the bridge language to a room of coalition diplomats and Vardesi representatives who had, for the first time in 26 years, been placed in the same physical space. 12 systems gone or severely damaged. Billions of people, billions of beings, displaced or dead. And that's on one side. We don't have the Vardesi casualty figures, but we know the compact fleet's operational assessment. They took losses that were, by the standards of their doctrine, catastrophic. He had paused. We can end this in a way that makes a future conflict more likely or less likely. That is actually the only real choice in front of us. Everything else is details. The Vardesi representatives had not responded immediately. The Vardesi communication style involved long silences that human diplomatic staff had learned, over the years of intermittent back-channel contact, to interpret as active processing rather than rejection. The silence lasted 11 minutes. Then the Vardesi senior representative had said in the bridge language, something that translated approximately as, "The small ones make a sensible argument. We will consider the boundary terms." The small ones was the Vardesi designation for humanity, derived from the fact that humans were, by Verdesi biological standards, physically compact. The human delegation had been informed of this early in the backchannel process. They had found it, by the unanimous account of several witnesses, genuinely funny. The ceasefire was signed 48 days later. In the aftermath, the Council convened to assess the integration, not the military outcomes, but the broader question that had been at the center of the contact debate. What had bringing humanity into the coalition produced, and what were the implications? The assessment was not simple. On the military side, the human integration had contributed materially to the coalition's survival. The doctrinal innovations, the accelerated deployment timeline, the specific tactical engagements where human flexibility had altered outcomes, these were documented and measurable. The Strategic Assessment Bureau concluded, conservatively, that without human participation, the probability of a favorable outcome had been approximately 22%. With it, the outcome achieved was the best realistic scenario from the pre-contact projections. On the institutional side, the integration had produced permanent changes to the coalition's structure. The human delegation had been granted full council membership in year 15, ahead of the originally projected timeline, after a procedural review that concluded their institutional participation had moved beyond the framework designed for provisional members. Their presence in council deliberations had been, by most accounts, disruptive in ways that were frequently useful. They asked foundational questions that long-established members had stopped asking because the answers were assumed, and some of those assumed answers had, upon examination, turned out to be wrong. On the question of what humanity became, the answer, after 26 years, was a work in progress. They had not become expansionist in the way Delegate Suri had feared. They had not become an uncritical client in the way Delegate Vosh had worried. They had not been broken by the introduction to interstellar war in the way Delegate Mareth had been concerned about. They had been changed, significantly, in ways that their own historians were still documenting, but the change had not collapsed the institutional structures and the internal governance efforts that Yoskavil had described. What they had become was something more complicated. A spacefaring civilization with battle-tested military capacity, an earned seat at a table they had not known existed 14 months before they asked their first questions, and all the complex pressures that came with both of those things. In the council chamber's first full session after the ceasefire, Sarathul, older now, her four forearms showing the stiffness that age brought to threnic joints, was seated next to the human delegation for the first time without a protocol barrier between them. The human lead delegate, Asanti, had leaned over during a procedural recess and said quietly, "I've been meaning to ask." The researcher. The one from the observatory years before contact. What happened to her? Sarathul looked at him for a moment. The question was not in any briefing document. She was not certain how he had learned about the incident. She retired from the SETI program, Sarathul said. She taught at a university for several years. After the contact transmissions, she gave an interview in which she said she had always believed the search would succeed. She was simply sorry she had not been there when it did. Asanti was quiet for a moment. She was there though. In a way. Sarathul considered that. Yes, she said. She was. The session resumed. Around the table sat representatives of 19 civilizations, 18 that had been there before and one that had not. The galaxy had not become simple. It had not become safe. It remained large and complex and in many places dark, and the Verdesi settlement was a ceasefire, not a peace, and there were other things moving at the edges of monitored space that the intelligence services were watching with the careful attention of people who had learned what it cost to be unprepared. But the vote had been taken. The decision had been made. And the species that had spent 11 years in an observatory looking for something real, and 100 years building imperfect institutions towards something better, and 26 years fighting alongside beings they had barely had time to know, that species was at the table. Whatever came next, they would face it with the rest. That was in the end what the debate had been about. That was in the end what it had decided.